Frank Sinatra's knife stops halfway through the steak. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't have to. The Villa Capri hums, laughter, clinking glass, a piano buried in smoke, until Frank looks down at the plate. A thin ribbon of pink shows where the blade opened the meat. "This is medium," he says, like he's reading a verdict. Across the table, Dean Martin keeps chewing, eyes half-lidded, a cigarette balanced between two fingers. The waiter, Joseph Romano, 22, new enough to still hear his own heartbeat, stands beside Frank's shoulder with a tray tucked under his arm. He'd repeated the order in the kitchen. "Rare. I want to hear it moo." He'd laughed because laughter felt safer than fear. Frank looks up at him. "I said rare." Joseph's mouth opens. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinatra. I'll take it back right away." Frank's gaze doesn't move. It pins Joseph in place. "Are you deaf?" Frank asks, voice soft, "or just stupid?" Forks hover at nearby tables. Conversations shrink. People who've never met Sinatra still know the rules. Don't stare, don't interfere, don't make the wrong kind of sound. Joseph swallows. "No, sir. I heard you. Frank drops his napkin onto the plate as if it's contaminated. "Get the manager." No one at Frank's table speaks. Sammy Davis Jr. studies his dinner like it might save him. Peter Lawford shifts, glancing toward the bar, then away again. Joseph turns toward the hallway that leads to the kitchen. "Now," Frank says. Joseph nods too fast and starts to step back. "Stop," Frank says, and Joseph stops. "Before you go, look at me." Joseph looks. Frank leans forward just slightly, the smallest movement with the weight of a threat. "I want you fired. Tonight. Do you understand that?" Joseph's eyes burn. A tear breaks free and hangs at the edge of his lower lid, humiliating in the bright restaurant light. Frank has another line. "You people," he says, tasting the words like something sour, "you can't do anything right." Dean's fork pauses over his pasta. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just a pause that doesn't belong. Dean lowers the fork. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, casual. Then he looks at Joseph, really looks at him, and the kid feels it like warmth under a winter coat. "Joe," Dean says, "easy, take it easy." Joseph blinks, startled by his own name in Dean Martin's mouth. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't been asked. Frank's jaw flexes. "I didn't ask you, Dean." Dean sets his glass down with a quiet click. "Frank," he says, calm as sleep, "it's a steak." Frank's eyes cut to him. "Stay out of it." A warning. A line in the sand. Dean leans back in his chair like he has all night. Smoke from his cigarette drifts upward, slow and lazy. "No," Dean says. "I'm not staying out of it." The words are quiet, but they travel. Sammy's head snaps up. Peter goes still. Even the bartender pauses mid-pour, amber suspended in the air. Dean keeps his eyes on Frank, steady, almost bored. "Let the kid take it back. Bring you a new one. Or eat that one. But knock it off." Frank's face hardens. He shifts his shoulders like he's readying for a fight he's never had to consider at his own table. "You telling me what to do?" Frank says. Dean's mouth twitches, not quite a smile. "I'm telling you what you're doing." Joseph stands between them like a mistake nobody wants to claim. If he moves, he's wrong. If he stays, he's wrong. Frank leans in. "You want to play hero for a waiter?" Dean holds Frank's gaze without blinking. "I want you to shut your mouth." One sentence. The whole restaurant freezes. Frank's pupils tighten. For a beat, it looks like he might stand, like he might swing, like he might do what he's done before to people who couldn't afford to hit back. Then Frank smiles. Not friendly. Calculating. "Polly," he says, soft as velvet over steel. "You sure you want this?" Dean doesn't move. Joseph's tear finally falls. And the next 5 seconds decide who runs this room. Frank Sinatra doesn't raise his voice because he doesn't need to. In 1962, his anger travels faster than sound. It moves through phone lines, through studio offices, through Vegas showrooms and backrooms where favors are owed and never forgotten. Frank Sinatra is not just a singer. He's leverage. He's access. He's consequence. When Frank wants something, doors open. When Frank wants someone gone, they stay gone. Everyone in Hollywood knows this, especially the people sitting at his table. Sammy Davis Jr. keeps his posture loose, but his shoulders are tight. He has talent pouring out of him, but the world still makes him earn every inch. Frank's protection isn't optional. It's survival. Peter Lawford smiles when required, nods when appropriate. His connections matter. Frank's approval matters more. Joey Bishop isn't here tonight, but he knows the rules as well as anyone. You joke with Frank. You orbit Frank. You never cross Frank. Because Frank remembers. He remembers slights. He remembers disloyalty. And he remembers who stayed silent when silence was required. The Rat Pack isn't just friendship. It's hierarchy. And Frank sits at the top. The Villa Capri understands this better than most places in Los Angeles. It's why Frank's table sits in the back, why the lighting is just dim enough, why the staff knows his drink before he orders it. This is Frank's room even when it's full of other people. Tonight should have been easy. They'd flown in from Vegas that afternoon, tired but loose, still riding the hum of applause from the sands. They'd laughed over drinks. Dean had told a story that didn't go anywhere and didn't need to. Sammy had done impressions. Frank had been in a good mood. Good moods with Frank are fragile things. One wrong note. One wrong word. One steak cooked 30 seconds too long. Joseph Romano never stood a chance of knowing that. He'd been nervous the moment he saw the reservation. Sinatra. Party of 4. Back table. He'd washed his hands twice. Checked his pen. Repeated the orders like prayers. Rare steak. Pasta. Chicken. Fish. He'd done everything right. Almost everything. Now he stands frozen between the most powerful man in the room and the only man who just told him to shut up. Frank doesn't look at Joseph anymore. He looks at Dean. "You forget who you're talking to?" Frank says. Dean exhales smoke through his nose. "No." That answer lands wrong. Frank shifts in his chair, slow and deliberate, like he's giving everyone time to reconsider their positions. His reputation isn't built on explosions alone. It's built on moments like this, where people realize they've gone too far and retreat. Sammy waits for Dean to soften it, to laugh, to backtrack. Dean doesn't. "I'm talking to my friend," Dean says. "And my friend's being ugly." Frank's smile fades. The room leans in without meaning to. "You calling me ugly?" Frank asks. Dean shrugs. "Acting that way." Peter clears his throat, then thinks better of it. The sound dies before it fully exists. Frank's voice drops. "You want to embarrass me in my own place?" Dean finally leans forward. Not aggressive. Intent. "You're doing that yourself." The words don't echo. They don't need to. This is what nobody ever gives Frank. A mirror. Joseph's hands start shaking again. He stares at the carpet, counting patterns, anything but the men deciding his future over a plate of meat. Frank studies Dean now, really studies him. Not like a boss. Like a man reassessing an equation he thought was settled years ago. Dean Martin doesn't need him. That's the difference, and Frank knows it. Dean has his own records. His own movies. His own television show. His own audience. If the Rat Pack vanished tomorrow, Dean would still walk into rooms exactly like this one and be welcomed. That kind of independence changes the math. Frank's power feeds on need, on fear, on gratitude that curdles into obedience. Dean brings none of that to the table. "Everybody's watching," Frank says quietly. Dean nods. "Good." That's when Frank realizes something has already slipped out of his control. The room isn't waiting to see what happens to the waiter anymore. It's waiting to see what happens to him. Frank glances around. Forks suspended. Glasses untouched. Staff pretending not to look while looking anyway. He looks back at Dean. "You're really going to do this?" Frank says. Dean meets his eyes, steady as stone. "I already did." The silence stretches, thick enough to taste. And Frank Sinatra has to decide whether to crush the moment or swallow it. Frank Sinatra doesn't move. Not right away. He lets the silence do the work. He's used to it bending people. Used to watching shoulders sag, eyes drop, voices soften. Silence has always been on his side. But this silence is different. It doesn't belong to him. Dean sits across the table, relaxed, almost comfortable, like he's waiting for coffee to cool. No anger. No challenge in his eyes. Just certainty. Frank taps his fingers once against the table. "You done?" Frank asks. Dean nods. "Yeah." One word. It lands heavier than anything shouted. Sammy's breath catches. Peter stares at the tablecloth like it might swallow him whole. Joseph Romano feels his knees weaken, his entire future balanced on two men who've stopped caring about him and started measuring each other. Frank leans back. When he speaks, it's not loud. It's precise. "You ever think," Frank says, "that maybe you don't get to decide how I handle my business?" Dean tilts his head. "I'm not deciding anything. I'm telling you to stop." Frank smiles again, thinner this time. "Or what?" Dean shrugs. "Or nothing." That answer irritates Frank more than a threat ever could. Nothing means Dean isn't posturing. Nothing means Dean isn't bluffing. Nothing means Dean isn't afraid of the outcome. Frank's eyes flick to Joseph for half a second, then back to Dean. "You going to take responsibility for him?" Dean glances at the kid. "He doesn't need me to take responsibility. He needs you to leave him alone." Joseph's chest tightens. He hasn't moved. He hasn't been dismissed. He's still trapped in the open, exposed. Frank sighs, exaggerated, like a man indulging a child. "You know what loyalty is, Dean?" Frank asks. Dean answers without hesitation. "Yeah." Frank leans forward again. "It's standing with your friends." Dean's voice stays level. "That's what I'm doing." The words hit Frank sideways. Loyalty, in Frank's world, means alignment. It means defense. It means silence when silence is convenient. Dean's loyalty looks different. It looks like friction. Frank's jaw tightens. He stares at Dean long enough that it becomes uncomfortable for everyone else to witness. This isn't theater anymore. This is private, happening in public by accident. "You always do this," Frank says. "You always got to be the guy." Dean smiles faintly. "No. I just don't like watching you kick down." That's it. That's the line. Frank straightens. The air shifts. This is the moment people remember, the instant before something breaks. Joseph squeezes his tray so hard his knuckles go white. Frank could end this any number of ways. He could stand up. He could raise his voice. He could tell the manager to fire the kid anyway, just to prove a point. He could make Dean regret this tomorrow, next week, 10 years from now. Everyone in the room knows it. Frank knows they know it. That's when he notices something else. No one is looking at Joseph anymore. They're all watching him. The power has turned. Frank exhales slowly through his nose. The anger doesn't vanish. It recalibrates. He looks at Dean, really looks at him, and for the first time tonight there's no calculation in his eyes. Just recognition. "Polly," Frank says quietly. Dean waits. "You're a pain in my ass." Dean nods. "Been told." A beat. Another. Frank reaches for his knife. The sound of metal against porcelain is almost deafening. He cuts another piece of steak. Sammy's shoulders drop an inch. Peter releases a breath he didn't know he was holding. Somewhere near the bar, a glass finally clinks against another. Frank lifts the bite, studies it like it might betray him again. Then he eats it. Joseph doesn't move. Frank chews slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off Dean. When he swallows, he gestures once with the knife. "Get out of here, kid," Frank says, like he's dismissing a thought. Joseph hesitates, unsure if he heard right. Dean looks at him. "You're good," he says. Joseph nods too many times and backs away, heart pounding, legs barely working. He disappears into the kitchen like a man escaping a fire. The table remains tense. Frank keeps eating. Dean picks up his fork and returns to his pasta as if nothing extraordinary has happened. But everyone knows something has. And when the meal finally ends, Frank pushes back his chair. "Walk with me," he says to Dean. Not a request. They stand. And whatever's about to be said won't have witnesses. They step outside into the night air, away from the smoke and the staring eyes. Los Angeles hums softly around them. A car idles at the curb. Somewhere down the block, laughter spills out of another restaurant that has no idea what almost happened inside the Villa Capri. Frank lights a cigarette with steady hands. "You made me look bad in there," he says. Dean buttons his jacket. "You were doing fine on your own." Frank exhales smoke and lets out a short laugh. Not sharp. Not angry. Real. "You know," Frank says, "most guys wouldn't dare." Dean shrugs. "Most guys need you." Frank studies him for a long moment. No audience. No table. No power play left to perform. "That kid," Frank says finally. "You didn't even know him." Dean nods. "Didn't need to." Frank looks away toward the street. His voice lowers. "You ever think about what it costs to be me?" Dean doesn't answer right away. "Yeah," he says. "I think about it all the time." Frank flicks ash to the pavement. "People don't tell me the truth." Dean smiles faintly. "That's because they want something." Frank glances at him. "And you?" Dean meets his eyes. "I want you to be better than this." The words hang there, unchallenged. Frank shakes his head slowly. "You're the only one who talks to me like that." "I know." "Why?" Dean considers it. "Because if I don't, nobody will." Frank laughs again, softer this time. He slips an arm around Dean's shoulders and pulls him in, brief and rough and familiar. "You're still a pain," Frank says. Dean pats his chest. "Someone has to be." They walk to the car together. The door closes. The night swallows them. Inside the Villa Capri, Joseph Romano leans against a stainless steel counter in the kitchen, breathing like he's just run a mile. The chef asks him if he's okay. He nods. Someone claps him on the shoulder. No one fires him. Years later, Joseph will still remember the sound of that fork touching the plate. He'll remember how close he came to losing everything over a mistake that couldn't be undone. And he'll remember the man who didn't have to say anything, but did. Sammy Davis Jr. will talk about that night once, years down the line. He'll say he saw something rare, someone standing up to Frank Sinatra and living to tell the story. He'll say it wasn't courage. It was respect. Peter Lawford will say Frank loved all of them, but he needed Dean. needed someone who didn't flinch. And Dean will never brag about it. To him, it was just dinner. Frank Sinatra will go on being Frank Sinatra. Powerful, volatile, larger than life. But every so often, when his temper starts to rise, someone will see him pause. Just a second longer than before. As if he's remembering a voice across a table. Not loud, not afraid, telling him to stop. And Frank listening. This channel is for people who notice who actually holds the power. Like and subscribe if you agree.